We're here at Loughborough University during the ICA 2018 conference with Professor Geoffrey Raymond from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Geoff, thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview in this really short period of time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled and somewhat amazed that you might find what I have to say interesting. So I'm really glad that I can do this.
So the first question, and that's something that we usually ask, is how did you get interested in conversational analysis?
So I applied to graduate school in sociology, mostly interested in doing ethnography. I got into two schools that had very good ethnography programs, and I ended up picking UCLA because I really thought they had the people that I most wanted to work with. So I came to UCLA to do ethnographic research. That's really what I thought I would do. And in the department's wisdom, they paired me with Steve Clayman as my first year graduate advisor. And I think that's partly because the ethnographic project I did as a senior in college was in a setting that involved talk and was largely focused on talk. And so I think they saw me as a potential person who might do CA, though that was not my plan. And I got there in my first year. There were no, first quarter, there were no classes in ethnography. And Steve Clayman said, you know, there's this class in conversation analysis taught by a guy named Manny Schegloff. You should give it a try. So not knowing who Manny was or what CA was, I took the class, and I think I knew within a couple of weeks that that's exactly what I would be doing. Wow. I was so surprised and gratified to find a kind of social science that was capable of a level of precision in its ability to understand and describe the lives of the social lives of humans, and then also that still had kind of an explanatory power in terms of understanding aspects of what they're doing and the systematic forms of social organization that underlie them. That I knew that there was nothing like that in ethnography. There was nothing like that in any other kind of work I'd done. And I think once, if you're serious, I think once you've seen that, it's very hard to go backwards. And I think, you know, we come to CA from different disciplinary backgrounds. So I think it's probably a very different experience if you're coming to CA as a linguist. But certainly coming to CA as a sociologist, I just knew there was no other form of social science that was, in my view, serious in that way, cumulative in its findings, robust and capable of a real precision that again was kind of, for me, breathtaking. And I think the other thing about it was that Manny could couple, in his lectures, that, and in his written work, that level of precision in description and analysis with a capacity to open up what clearly mattered for the participants in their lives at the moment they're engaged in the conduct that he's analyzing. And I found that especially compelling because, I mean, you know, to me, understanding humans and human social life has to be about understanding what people care about and what they evidently treat as consequential for who they are and what they're trying to do. And so you know, I still have, of course, never found anything that compares to it. Yeah.
So taking that class was
the turning point, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and I never took it. I did take an ethnography class, but never seriously pursued that again, and started working with Manny, John, and Steve from that point on. And I think you know, there were a number of other things once I got involved that made it a very compelling discipline. So initially I was attracted to kind of the intellectual rigor of it and the other parts of it that I've described, but then also there was a community of people working that I found really compelling. So while I was there, when I first showed up and took that first class, Anna Lindstrom was my TA. So she was the one who was kind of guiding some of the work that we were doing. the next year, I think, Geoff Robinson showed up, and then a year after that, Tanya Stivers came. And then there were a number of visitors who were there at that time. Maria-Elena Sorinen was there, Anssi Parakala was there. There were just, the sort of intellectual vibrancy of what was happening was, just inescapable. And so it also was really compelling for that reason. It was just, and of course then having Manny, John, and Steve teaching was, I think, now I can see how lucky I was, but I think at the time I just thought, that's how graduate school is. I think I was really very fortunate. And then the last kind of thing I'll mention is that a thing I noticed immediately was that we had data sessions. And so we sat around analyzing data collaboratively, and I got to see how Manny and John and Steve analyzed data on a weekly basis. Mm-hmm. And to hear the difference between the way I talked about data and the way they talked about data, and at the risk of kind of trivializing what we do, a lot of what we do is tell stories about data. There are a range of criteria we use to evaluate the stories we tell about data, but if you don't have an interesting story to tell about the data, we don't have much to say, or people won't be very interested in listening. And so I quickly realized that I would have a kind of practice analyzing data on a regular basis in conjunction with people who do it very well, who are the founders of the area. Whereas if I was doing ethnography, I would largely be collecting the data on my own, and then I would have to go home and figure out what the hell to do with it. And I'm sure there are ethnographic programs where they workshop things, and people have similar experiences. So I don't mean to cast aspersions on ethnography as an approach. I still use ethnographic research methods in the work I do in policing, so I'm very much a fan of it. My collaborator in the police project is an ethnographer, so I don't mean to disparage ethnography in any way. But I could see for myself, I didn't come from an academic family. The idea of becoming an academic still seemed kind of strange to me. And so having the chance to work with people on a regular basis before I started to have to do work on my own was a real advantage of this kind of work.
So how did you go about to discover or choose your PhD topic, and what was it about?
So my dissertation was, I think it was called The Structure of Responding. It was about responses to yes-no interrogatives, and I had the novel observation that people, when asked a yes-no question, or in what's now called the polar interrogative, answered overwhelmingly with a yes or a no. And this struck me as a profoundly interesting observation. Now, I think a lot of CA and ethnomethodology starts with what are well-known features of social life that by virtue of everyone knowing it, most people think are trivial, are therefore trivial and uninteresting because everyone knows that. I think that Gene Lerner used to talk about Sachs's observations on what everyone knows, and the more people, if everyone knows it, then it's a really powerful aspect of social life. It has a kind of obvious significance for what happens, and so we take things about what everyone knows and show how it gets organized. And so my dissertation looked at people responding to yes-no interrogatives and whether they produce a yes or no or some alternative to that, and what was happening, therefore, when they respond with a yes or no and with alternatives, with what I called non-conforming responses. And then it looked at a range of other aspects of the design and placement of the yes and no and the things that come before it and after it. I kind of got to that project in a roundabout way. Initially, I had made some observations about So, and I subsequently wrote up in a paper called The Standalone So. And I was working on that project, and one of the observations I had made is that the element of a long response that indicated that the response was likely to be over at that TCU. So if you have a response that's composed of multiple TCUs, then the possible completion of any one of those TCUs doesn't project its possible completion because those possible completions are of units, so you have to have some other extra or external to the TCU way of indicating that this is the last TCU. And so I was looking at how so worked as a turn final component. I figured I needed to explain how the response came to be so long. How did this response come to take up so much space? And it was that someone asked a yes/no question, or a yes/no interrogative, and they didn't respond with a yes or a no. And so I presented that to Manny, and he said, "Oh, that's interesting. You might want to think about that." So what I thought was going to be my dissertation was, I thought my dissertation was going to be about so, and the uses and sequential positioning of so within responses and in other places. It ended up being this quite different project. And I've always used that example with students to remind them to be open about what they're looking at. It can often be the profound, well, I don't want to say that my work is profound. The thing that I ended up seeing as more consequential ended up being something that I came across in the course of doing something else. So I thought I was doing one thing, I ended up making an observation and seeing that that observation had some explanatory power or it had some legs, and that's what I ended up focusing on. And so I think it can just, in that sense, I think it's wrong to say that I chose a dissertation topic. I think I discovered a dissertation topic, if I can put it that way. I guess in some respect I did choose between those two, but I think it was not really a choice once I kind of saw the possibility of working on the yes/no interrogatives or polar interrogatives. And then I think the other kind of lesson that I took from that was that the more ubiquitous something is, the more recurrent it is, probably the more interesting it is in terms of trying to understand the procedural infrastructure of social life, of understanding the practices of conversation. So yeah, that's how.
All right, that's really fascinating. Still related to your PhD, I was wondering if you could share a bit about what it was like to work with Manny Schegloff.
Oh, sure. I worked really closely with Manny, John Heritage, and Steve Clayman, and each of them were really important in helping me develop the dissertation and kind of the final form it took. Clearly a lot of my work was very much inspired by what I saw in Manny's work, and I wanted to kind of copy what he was trying to do as closely as I could, even though it would end up being what I do. But his influence would be apparent in it, as was I hope the influence of John and Steve, whose work I admire just as much. What it was like to work with Manny. Manny, first of all, I think was the reputation Manny had when I showed up at UCLA was the other graduate students said things like, "Don't ever have him as your dissertation advisor. He hasn't signed a dissertation in 10 years. You'll never get out of here. He's really tough." And my experience of him was so different. I mean, he's such a warm and caring person, a really rigorous thinking person, I like to say that, to this day, I carry around a voice of Manny in my head when I'm doing work, thinking, what would Manny say about that? And those came from, having conversations with him where I thought I would be saying something smart or interesting, and his response would indicate that that I hadn't thought things through quite carefully enough, or I thought I had an analysis that really nailed some piece of data, and then he would do his analysis of it, and I had missed most of what was happening, and those memories were kind of really seared in me, but he really taught me to not be so focused on whether I got it right or not, and be much more concerned about how we could understand some piece of data. And it didn't really matter if I got the analysis wrong in the beginning. I would be terribly embarrassed. You know, I had said this thing out loud, and then it was clear once he said something that what I said was just completely wrong, and that really made it all about me and not about the data. And so he kind of taught me to let go of that, and I think that's been really helpful. He was also a really interesting mentor. I've said this, I think it's true. I've said this before, I think it's true that I don't remember Manny answering a question. So if I would ask him a question, he would ask me questions in response. And what was really, I mean, first of all, I try to do that with my students, and it's incredibly hard, because the level of self-discipline it takes to not just offer what you think is the case is, you know, is pretty remarkable. But the consequence of that is that whatever I came up with was, I mean, a product of his prodding and questioning, but it felt like mine. It felt like something I had come to by virtue of his asking. And so I think he was a really distinctive mentor in that way. And yet sometimes graduate students need questions answered, you know. I mean, of course, he would answer basic things, and certainly gave me plenty of advice. But a really kind of consequential turning point in my dissertation was I had taken a job at York. I hadn't finished my dissertation. I needed to finish it by the end of my first year, or they probably didn't want me to continue at York. And you know, it was, I think, the beginning of the summer, the beginning of the spring, and I was getting really panicked. Would I be able to finish the dissertation? And I sent Manny a chapter, and he said, I don't see how I could possibly know whether you're going to finish given this. And I was really panicked, you know, and I think I probably didn't handle it very well. That's been my experience with a lot of things in life. I retrospectively realize, you know, just how badly I behaved. But I was kind of panicking, and I really didn't know what to do, and I had been working on the yes no interrogatives, and I think I had mostly worked out what was going on, but I just didn't have a way of nailing that it was an orientation to this preference for type conformity and not some other aspect of preference or some other aspect of conversational organization. And so I also sent the paper, the chapter, to John Heritage, and he read it. And we were talking on the phone. It was an expensive long-distance phone call, as I recall. And there wasn't Skype at the time, which I guess dates me a little bit. He suggested, why don't you start by comparing these two excerpts? That turned out to be, so he gave me an answer, first of all. He gave me a suggestion in a way that I think Manny, you know, was probably reluctant to do. And it really unlocked how I approached the whole dissertation. And I think if you go and look at either the dissertation or the AJS or the ASR article, it's a series of comparisons of pairs of excerpts that allow me to sort of isolate distinct aspects of the interrogative and the relevancies it sets in motion and the way responses deal with that. And once I had those two pairs at the beginning and could then see a methodology out of the pairing of excerpts in that way, I wrote the entire dissertation in about a month and a half.
Wow.
I just knocked it out. I mean, because I knew what I wanted to say, and once I had a method of getting there, it really made all the difference. So I always credit John with, you know, kind of making that really consequential intervention. And I think of it as a methodological kind of intervention as much as a compositional one, although I haven't written about it in methodological terms. Anyways, it was a great experience working with those three. You know, they each gave very different kinds of help and advice, and I think my impression going in was, you know, that I would get, you know, one thing from Manny, I would get something very different from John, and I would get something very different from Steve. And that turned out to be true in a certain way, but what I thought I would get from it was so different than what I actually did. And I thought, you know, Steve is such a sweet guy that I thought, you know, I need someone on my committee who's really emotionally supportive. And Steve, of course, is a wonderful, warm person. But I think he was the hardest reader I had. And I've always really appreciated kind of Steve's careful reading, and the feedback he gave me was so important in how I think about writing and how I think about laying things out. And to this day, I mean, you know, some of my favorite papers are by Steve because I just love the way he writes. And so, yeah, I got something really different from each of them. And of course, I also had two other people on my committee who continue to influence me to this day, Jean Lerner and Sandy Thompson. And you know, Sandy was just the warm, she ended up being the really warm mentor that I needed, but also gave me a lot of great advice on grammar, which I think, you know, she was clearly the linguist of the group. And Jean was really helpful in getting me to see that what I was doing was serious, that it could matter in some way, and I think that was really important for me. And then I was fortunate enough to work with Jean for a number of years until I retired last year, and I continue to think of that as like I was in postgraduate school with Jean until the day he retired.
Wow.
And I just, you know, I think of him as such a remarkable conversation analyst. And really, I think, to me, one of the most kind of creative conversation analysts that I know.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
That sounds like such a supportive environment.
It was fun, yeah, it was really fun. And hard. They were really hard, it was challenging, but they were good, yeah, yeah. So all the things that people said, you know, turned out not to be true,
All right.
which was good.